I went to Paris just before the end of the millennium, and I attended the great Fauve retrospective at the Grand Palais. Some of you may have been there, but it was one of those events in retrospect which changed my life. So suddenly, I saw Fauve paintings. I'd never seen them. I'd seen a few in books. I knew who the Fauves were from studying art history. I hadn't actually seen these paintings in reality, and I was absolutely astonished. Everything about the way this painting is made is entirely different from the way Sigurd and the Camden Town painters painted. This was not painting as description, this was painting as emotion. This is a modern romantic painting in the same way that Delacroix and Géricault and Rossetti would understand the word romantic. This is a painting of heightened emotional response to the subject, a personal emotional response. And it never occurred to me that you could paint sand or earth bright red. It never occurred to me that you could use a kind of primrose yellow in the sky, that you could have the ground showing through, that you could use colours that have come straight out of the tube, unmixed, saturated, that you could take every possible, what you might call liberty, and still produce something that had the drama of a kind of plein air painting, but with the emotional punch of somebody who had been released from years of kind of suppressed emotion. And you probably know the story. In 1904, Matisse, with his best friend Albert Marquet, and the young André Derain, who was 10 years younger than Marquet and Matisse, they set off for the Western Mediterranean fishing village of Collior, where this was painted. And for about 2.5 months, they stayed in the station hotel there, and they painted these pictures. The local fishermen thought they had gone entirely balmy, couldn't understand what on earth was going on. They got short of money to pay the rent. The proprietor of the hotel agreed to take a number of paintings in compensation for rent, but didn't know, of course, that the paintings were going to turn out like this. So on the last day, the proprietor was presented with paintings like this and was completely horrified. Years later, the family sold most of these paintings and became very wealthy, as you might imagine. This is a painting by Matisse, painted from the window of the hotel in the same year, 1904, and exhibited at the Salon 1905, along with that Derain painting. And that Salon of Salon d'Automne of 1905 was especially famous because a critic came to the Salon and wrote about their work as he described it as the work of une fauve, a wild beast, and of course the epithet stuck. So what's going on here? This is painting in which colour has been freed, has been unshackled from a tool to describe a surface literally, and it's been liberated in such a way that it can describe an emotion. Colour becomes a tool for emotional expression, a tool that can express joy, wonder, love, passion, sensibility, sensuality. It's all there in the colour. By moving away from describing a surface literally, the artist has started to express something internal, something from the subconscious. The narrative, the traditional subject of the painting, becomes less important in favour of pictorial design. One of the earliest comprehenders of modern painting was Maurice Denis, who was the spokesperson for the Nabi group of painters. Nabi means prophet in Hebrew, and the Nabi group included Denis and Le Corbusier and Gauguin and Vuillard and Bonnard. So it was a rather exceptional group that exhibited together for a few years in the 1890s. And Maurice Denis said, a picture, before it is a nude, a warhorse, or any other anecdote, is a flat surface arranged with colours in a certain order. A picture, before it has any kind of subject, is a flat surface arranged with colours in a certain order. And this became the stated intention of modern painters, that the picture was first and foremost an abstract design. It was a division of pictorial space into patterns and marks and colours that ended up becoming a coherent whole. And it's clear that these colours owe a great deal to the mood and feelings and mental state of the painter, Matisse, and not a great deal to the kind of objective reality that you would expect a camera to record. Painted the following year, in 1906, André Derain came to London, and still with all colours blazing, he painted a city which in those days was engulfed in a semi-toxic smog that was grey and grimy, and yet to Derain he reinvented London as this kind of saturated southern city bursting with light. St Paul's Cathedral, rendered in French ultramarine paint with a little bit of cerulean in the most kind of primary colour, the yellow and the blue, absolute primary colours. And yet what's interesting about this painting, if you squint at it and try and make it into a kind of tonal painting, it sort of works tonally. The dark areas are still dark. So colours could have a strong tonal element. They weren't all applied with the same tone. The tones were different. So you can imagine the effect if you've been painting like I had been in a kind of post-Sickert Camden time way. You can imagine the effect that these paintings had on my sensibility. I was completely dumbfounded, inspired, horrified, and excited in equal measure by these pictures, and I wanted to do the same thing, but I had no idea how to get there. So I came back, and the first painting I tried to paint was this painting of Trafalgar Square on a January afternoon. And it is still very much a traditional tonal painting, essentially realistic. The colours that you see, they might be slightly heightened, but they basically describe the surfaces as I saw them and not as I felt them. The brushwork was a bit looser, but it was still a realistic kind of English tonal painting. It was absolutely nowhere near a Fauvis's painting. And every time I tried to venture into colorism, I ended up painting this kind of English tonal painting. I mean, this painting, painted in 2002, could have been painted in 1902. And in fact, it could have been painted, looks like an early Sickert. Still strong brush marks, vigorous paintwork, but still all about the light and the shade. Very restricted palette. So, I had a crisis. What on earth was I to do? I painted away, I piled the paint on, I squirted the paint out of the tubes. I tried absolutely everything to make my paintings like Derain's and Matisse's, but they wouldn't go like Derain's and Matisse's, and I couldn't work out why. And at the end of an immensely frustrating year, and after a particularly kind of gloomy visit by my dealer, who was David Messon at the time, and he came up to the studio and he was quite clearly completely puzzled and nonplussed and sounded horrified by the stuff that I had produced that year. I decided the only thing that could possibly redeem this appalling work was a bonfire. So I dragged a whole year's worth of work out to the end of the garden and set light to it, which is why I don't have any slides of that work. It precipitated a crisis in my marriage and a general crisis of one sort and another. And I remember actually locking in the studio and thinking I'm going to throw the keys into the pond, into the duck pond. In fact, I kind of metaphorically threw them, and in fact I didn't throw them into the pond. I kept them in the drawer of my desk, but I decided I wasn't going to be a painter anymore. And a few weeks later, I remember taking my sons to see HMS Victory, and I was on the deck with my boys, and I bumped into a friend. My friend I hadn't seen for a while. He said, "What are you doing now?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to be a bookseller." And he said, "Really? I thought you were a painter." I said, No, I've stopped painting now. I'm going to be a bookseller." And for several weeks, I thought about how I might open a bookshop in a local town in Suffolk where we lived. But I suppose it wasn't more than about 6 weeks of realising that I A, wasn't earning any money, and B, didn't have anything to do, that I thought, well, maybe I should open the door of the studio again, go back inside, and see what happens. So after a couple of months, 6 or 8 weeks, I did go back into the studio. But before I did, I had spent a critical and another life-changing day in the National Gallery, wandering around, looking at the paintings that I really admired, and trying to work out what it was that I liked about these paintings. And eventually, in the latter part of the afternoon, I've been looking at pictures for about 6 hours, what I realised is that the paintings that I was drawn to were paintings that were made with palettes that only had 1 or 2 primaries, but not 3 primaries. This was a sort of sort of road to Damascus moment, suddenly realizing that the problem with colour is if you use 3 primary colours, you are in deep trouble. You only need to use 1 or 2. So, thinking about this, I went back into the studio and I produced the first painting that I ever made, which wasn't realistic in the sense of taking the light, the way the light fell naturally as my starting point. And if you just go back a moment and look at that is actually painted the same year, at the beginning of the year, as this. So this is what came out of my kind of period of crisis. So what's happened here is I finally found a way of moving from traditional linear perspective, traditional aerial perspective, the sense of gradated tone. The space is flattened. The real sense of space, the illusion of space invented by Renaissance painters has gone. There's been a kind of slight upending of the horizontal. The squares on the table are not graded as they would be in traditional linear perspective drawing. The colours are heightened and interpreted, and the light source is a kind of all-round light, and there are no shadows cast by the objects. And this was all stuff being done by the faux painters, but it was just that I couldn't do it, and it was driving me balmy. And then suddenly, finally, I did find a way to do it, and started, this is, I'm afraid, a very bleached slide. It's a much richer painting, but this was the cover of the catalogue for my 2006 New York show. I moved to a gallery I'm still with 10 years ago in New York, and I finally kind of think I had absorbed the events that were so huge at the beginning of the 20th century in art, this whole business of flattened space and of making the design of the picture the central point rather than the narrative. And this picture shows my niece and my dog in a garden in Spain, and was hugely influenced, the way it was painted was hugely influenced by those post-impressionist painters. But the day after my exhibition opened in New York, I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Fine Art, and I saw this painting. Most of you will recognize this as a painting by Bonnard called The Garden or the Terrace at Vernon, or sometimes called Decor à Vernon. It's a painting he began in 1920 and finished just before the outbreak of World War II, 19 and a half years later. It's 8 feet wide, and every time I've been to New York since 2006, I have gone to look at this painting. Vernon was his house in Normandy, near his friend Monet, Giverny, and you're looking out onto the Normandy countryside there from his terrace, which is shaded. The narrative of this painting is complicated. The woman standing at the table is Marthe, his wife. The woman holding the fruit in the basket is probably also Marthe, his wife. And the woman on the right is probably Renée Monchatti, a woman with whom he had a brief love affair in the early 1920s. And she sadly committed suicide in 1925. And the figures on the left-hand side are, where you can see Bonnard down the far end, and I'm not quite sure who the near figure is. But it's interesting that in fact he used, for the shape of the figures, he used photographs of Mycenae period Greek statues that were in the museum in Athens. The painting is painted over a long period of time, first at his studio in Normandy, and then at his studio at the Cannes, suburb of Cannes, where he moved in 1926 and remained for the rest of his life. And it is a picture which has within it many of the ingredients, many of the finest ingredients of Bonnard's painting. His extraordinary ability to use paint in lots of different ways, this rich painterly language where the paint is applied sometimes transparently, sometimes opaquely, where the colours, as they move from one shape to another, change their tone, which allows the shapes, the big shapes, to remain whole shapes, even where they're subdivided. It's an extraordinary palette of deep blues and violets, and these kind of golden oranges and yellows. No kind of primary red in it. And it evokes a very strong mood, almost a dreamlike mood. It's a contemplation on these women who were so important in his life, and on his own response to the world around him, to nature, and well, the timeless business of living. I can't think of any other painting, any other 20th century painting. In fact, I can't think of any other painting period that has a tree trunk right down the middle of the picture, right in the foreground, and yet it's so beautifully painted, and with such kind of delicate sensitivity to the range of hues that he is using, that it is nothing but an asset, a kind of gentle shape where one can allow one's mind a moment of kind of peace and contemplation before moving on to the very colorist scene to the left. And Bonnard's work remained a huge influence on me and still does. And from that point onwards, I tried all sorts of different ways in which I might use the paint. Restricted palettes. Here you'll see a palette of blues and blue greys and blue violets, but there's no primary yellow in this palette, and there's no primary red. Well, there's no red at all in this palette, and therefore it has a particular mood. And I've continued to explore different ways in which I can apply the paint to evoke the feelings that I want to evoke. This painting is more recent from my last New York show, and it has within it something of the Vienna Secession, the work of Klimt and Schiele and their use of gold leaf. Somebody described it as where Klimt and Vuillard collide, maybe that's right. I think since that crucial period of 2004, 2005, I think I've become much less self-conscious and I just got on and painted. And I'm quite happy to continue to reinvent the way I apply the paint as often as I paint, which is pretty much every day of the week, every week of the year. So it's a constant process of reaching out to find a particular language which best expresses one's own heartfelt response to the world around one. So that brings me to the end of the journey of kind of how we got, or how I got to where I am.